Good evening. My name is David Quick. I'm the Adult Services Coordinator at the DC Public Library. I'm very happy to be here tonight and welcome you to the Southwest Neighborhood Library. This is one of our newest branches, and I'm happy to host an event in this beautiful building. I'm also happy to host a special event with Jamie Kirchick for Secret City, the hidden history of gay Washington for LGBTQ History Month. This is our first event with Little District Books. I'm very happy to include another one of DC's independent bookstores in one of our fabulous author talks, so thanks for being here tonight, Little District. I'm also happy to include Rainbow History Project as a very special partner in tonight's event to highlight LGBTQ history in the District of Columbia. I'm going to hand it off to Vincent to say a little bit about Rainbow History Project, but I do want to say a special thank you to Paul Smith tonight, who's going to lead our conversation with Jamie. Paul's a professor at Georgetown Law School who has worked for several decades in private practice and argued 21 cases in front of the Supreme Court, including the landmark case Lawrence v. Texas. So we're really glad to have Paul here tonight leading the conversation. Before I hand things over to Paul and Jamie, Vincent's going to say a little bit about Rainbow History Project. Thanks for being here tonight. We'll be all wrapped up by about 7:30, 7:35. Definitely need to be done by 7:45 when they start kicking us out. So thank you for being here tonight.
Thank you, David. Hello. Hello, my name is Vincent Slatt. I'm the Director of Archiving for the Rainbow History Project, which is our local all-volunteer nonprofit dedicated to LGBTQ history here in the district. Our mission is to collect, preserve, and promote the history of LGBTQ Washington. There's a lot of different ways for people to get involved with us, so check us out at rainbowhistory.org. One of the great ways is our oral history program, where we record the stories of people, about DC history. That program is actually something that Jamie Kirchick used quite frequently for his book project that you're all here to read about tonight. I think it was back in 2014 that Jamie and I first met to talk oral histories. So it's been a wonderful partnership, and we're glad to see the book ready. I've loved it. I hope you will too. Thank you very much.
Okay, hi everybody. It's nice to be here in this beautiful new library. Let me start by introducing our really honored guest here. James Kirchick is a writer, obviously, about human rights, politics, and culture. He's a non-resident senior fellow of the Atlantic Council and author of the book The End of Europe, Dictators, Demagogues, and the Coming Dark Age. Sounds pretty dark.
Prescient.
Also, happily, the author of Secret City, which we're going to talk about today. Graduate of Yale with degrees in history and political science, and a resident right here in our own District of Columbia. So welcome, Jamie.
Thank you, Paul.
It's really great to have you here to talk about this book. I must say I really enjoyed this book. As a gay man of a certain age who's lived in D.C. for about 43 years.
You're the target audience.
A few of them here, actually.
I can tell.
I enjoyed both the stuff that was pure history for me, but also the stuff where I started to recognize the venues and even some of the people as it got closer to the present. Why don't you start off by saying a little bit about how you came to write this book? It's a bit of a departure from the book about dictators and demagogues.
Well, thank you, Paul, for all your service and the work you've done. Thank you to the library. This is an incredible institution, and I'm very pleased to be here. Thank you to the Rainbow History Project. As Vincent said, I really relied on the oral histories that they have collected over many, many years. And thank you to Little District Books. I did not know that there was a new gay bookstore in Washington, filling the void that was left in this city when Lambda Rising closed. I know many of you remember Lambda Rising, I write about the history of Lambda Rising in my book, and so it's great to know that there is another gay bookstore here. I feel like Madonna, by the way, wearing this on my face. It's a little, actually, my first book I don't think is that well. There is a connection, which is my history. My interest in the Cold War and Cold War history, and that's really been my guiding intellectual passion since college. I went to Yale, where I studied under John Lewis Gaddis, who is the sort of dean of Cold War studies, and he's also the biographer of George Kennan, the great Cold War strategist. And so Professor Gaddis was teaching a seminar my junior year on the art of biography. And every week we would read a different biography. And the final term paper was we had to write a biography on anybody living or dead whose papers were at the Yale archives. And lo and behold, Larry Kramer had at that time just donated his papers to Yale. And I got to know Larry. I'm assuming he doesn't need an introduction to the people in this room. I got to know Larry, I got to interview him, I was using his papers, and developed a relationship with him, a real kind of, he was a cantankerous, obnoxious, lovable, wonderful, he was many things, and a very important person in all of our lives, actually. And he was obsessed with gay history, and in his belief, and he was correct in this, that mainstream historians had overlooked the role of gay people in history and had overlooked the role of homosexuality in history. And so when I moved down to Washington in 2007 to work at the New Republic magazine, I stayed in touch with him, and he was always pestering me, and is this person gay? Was James Jesus Angleton gay? Was George Washington gay? I mean, he was always, he thought everyone was gay. And the more I lived here, the more I realized that this is actually a very gay city. And it has been for a long time, and so that fascinated me. But also, the more I was just reading, and the more I was pursuing my intellectual passion in Cold War history, the more I was realizing that there was no worse thing that you could be in this town than gay. Even during the Cold War, it was worse to be a homosexual than a communist. And that, to me, was surprising. I mean, I knew it wasn't easy to be gay in American politics and government, but that was often conflated with communism, but was seen as actually worse than communism, was something that really shocked me. And I thought, you know what? What a fascinating way to look at this period of time stretching from the Roosevelt administration, the 1930s, the New Deal, World War II. We can get into why I started there. All the way up to the turn of the century. What a fascinating prism through which to study this entire sweep of history through the prism of this secret that was the worst possible thing you could be. This is a city that runs on secrets. It's a city where secrecy is a form of power, where the greater access to secrets that you have, the more power you have, right? And anyone who's worked in certain agencies in this town will know there are certain levels of security clearance that you can have, and the higher levels up you go, the more powerful and influential you are. And so homosexuality was a real, I refer to it in the book as the specter of homosexuality. It haunted this city for decades, and no one had done a full study of it. There was one short academic book. It's very good, but it's very limited in scope on the Lavender Scare in the 1950s, but there had been nothing else. Nothing about the role of homosexuality in espionage and the CIA through the presidencies, looking at the impact of homosexuality on the African-American civil rights movement, on Richard Nixon's paranoid mind, on Iran-Contra. There was a whole gay aspect of Iran-Contra, right? So putting all of this together into one long narrative, I felt as a journalist, and as a journalist you're always trying to find something new to say, right? You're trying to find new information. You want scoops. You want to bring something to light. This seemed like a big, important, fascinating topic to tackle. So that's why I did it. Yeah.
It sounds like you would certainly agree that Washington's the only city that would be an interesting secret gay history could be written about. If you did that about Boston or some other city, it'd probably be a lot less fascinating.
It'd be shorter, I think. Yeah.
Not because they're fewer, just be less good stories.
Less consequential. Yeah.
How did you go about, once you decided on this topic, I know you used the Radio History Project, but there must have been a million other ways about trying to gather all of these stories. I mean, because there's just an awful lot of different people and a lot of different stories in this book.
Yeah, I mean, the first level was just reading kind of books and magazine articles, newspaper articles. And every presidential biography I would read or memoir, there might be a page or two about, the gay advisor, the gay scandal that happened in this administration, right? The gay friend. And then that led me to search into archives and personal paper collections, right? So the first couple chapters of the book are about a man named Sumner Wells, who was FDR's Undersecretary of State.
Fascinating guy.
Yeah, and he was like the #2 in the State Department. And there was a man who tried to destroy him. His rival within the State Department was a man named William Bullitt, who was the first ambassador to the Soviet Union, then ambassador to France. It turns out William Bullitt's papers are also at Yale, at my alma mater, because he was a Yale grad, like pretty much everyone in the State Department or the CIA was, Yale or Harvard. His papers were there, right? And so Bullitt kept very meticulous diaries and notes, all of his meetings with Roosevelt in which he tried to convince Roosevelt to fire Wells, his meetings with Cordell Hull, the Secretary of State, right? So I used paper collections. Some of the findings just came randomly. For instance, I assumed that Ben Bradley, his papers might be interesting. This was the legendary editor of the Washington Post from the late 1960s through the 90s, really through about half of my book. And I happened to be in Texas, in Austin, Texas, for a speaking engagement. And Ben Bradley's papers are at the University of Texas at the Harry Ransom Center. And I was just going through the finding aid. I would type in the word gay, and it maybe came up once. There's one folder on like gay issues. But then I came across something. There was a title of a folder. It was, Ronald Reagan, allegations about 1980. I said, this seems interesting. And I open it up, and it contains the entire records of an investigation that the Washington Post launched in the summer of 1980 into allegations that Ronald Reagan was being controlled by a right-wing anti-communist homosexual cabal. And the Post never printed anything about this, okay? But Bob Woodward was involved in the investigation, and Lou Cannon, who was the dean of California newspaper reporters who came to work at the Post when Reagan became president. The Post investigated all these allegations. It's a wild story. It's recounted in the book.
Yeah.
That was just something I just happened upon without even knowing to look for it. And then I interviewed lots of people. I interviewed probably over 100 people. I see Paul Kunstler here in the front row. I didn't interview Paul, but I used your papers. And I used your oral history at the public library. But I interviewed Jan, right? Is that Jan? Yeah, I think I interviewed you. I interviewed lots of people. Oral histories were very important, not only the Rainbow History Project, but also presidential libraries have oral histories of everyone who worked in the administrations. And then, also very importantly, were declassified. I got government files declassified. So from the Civil Service Commission and from the FBI. One of the proudest findings that I'm most proud of in the book. It's the story I tell of a man who worked for LBJ named Robert Waldron, who some of you might have known as a very famous and well-respected interior decorator in Washington in the 70s and 80s and early 90s. He died of AIDS in 1996. But before that, and the reason he went into interior decorating was because he was pushed out of politics. He worked for LBJ as a young man from Texas on his staff. And then as LBJ was transitioning into the White House after the Kennedy assassination, Waldron had to undergo a background check, right? To work in the White House, you have to have a security check. And it was in the course of this background check that the Civil Service Commission discovered that he was gay. And like that, he was gone. His White House pass was revoked, and his political career was over. And I was able to find his story because I got his FBI file, over 1,000 pages of it declassified from the National Archives. And I'm proud to say not even Robert Caro was aware of this story.
Well, there you go.
I actually told Robert Caro about it. So it was a lot of work, and there was a lot of different sources and materials, and it's all in the bibliography.
Right. So a bunch of these stories are stories of people who are getting a little too close to power because they have the opportunity and they don't know how to stop, or maybe they just want to be there. And the different reactions that the country has at different times is sort of interesting to me, comparing the Sumner Wells story and how resistant FDR was to doing anything about Sumner Wells, even when everybody in Washington knew that he had been propositioning Pullman porters on the train. And
FDR's initial reaction was, well, he's not doing it on government time, is he?
Right. And then in 1940, the Deputy Secretary of State is doing this, whereas in the 1960s, LBJ, you're out. Walter Jenkins gets arrested in the, obviously that was probably not an easier call, got arrested in the Y across the street from the White House.
Yeah.
But
I think part of the reason why FDR was so resistant to fire Wells, there's a couple of reasons. One is that this is it's after World War II begins, right? And we're in the middle of this global conflict, And Sumner Welles is effectively the Secretary of State because the nominal Secretary of State, Cordell Hull, is sick and barely shows up for work, and he's old, and so he's relying a lot on Welles. And Welles is a very skilled diplomat. And despite being what we would now consider an alcoholic, he was a highly functioning one. And lots of men in that era were highly functioning alcoholics. FDR was also, according to his son, willing to forgive any of his friends anything that they did while they were drunk. And again, this is not, these are not the standards that we would, nor would we tolerate someone propositioning Pullman porters on a train, right? But standards were different then, okay? He was willing to forgive him all this.
Until he was really forced.
He was forced to do it, but it's also important to note, while FDR was protecting his friend, Sumner Welles, from homosexual smears and accusations, he was quietly encouraging what was going on at the same time was the first outing in American politics, which was of a conservative Democratic senator from Massachusetts, an isolationist, David Walsh. Though a member of Roosevelt's own party, was a longtime antagonist of Roosevelt's. In May 1942, just 6 months after Pearl Harbor, Walsh is accused by the New York Post, which at the time, as hard as it is to believe today, was a liberal newspaper. He was accused by the New York Post of frequenting a male brothel near the Brooklyn Navy Yard in the presence of Nazi spies. Okay? Now, none of this was true. Okay? Walsh was likely gay. He was almost certainly gay, but it was a case of mistaken identity. He
never actually went to the location.
There was no evidence that he went to that. No, and in fact, they later, after the Post made these allegations, they then hired after the FBI did a full investigation and exonerated Walsh, the Post decided to hire a private investigator, and they found out, and this is so crazy, they could have found this out from the very beginning. They checked his attendance record in the Senate, and they realized that he couldn't have been at this brothel when he was accused of. You think they would do that?
Very sophisticated detective
You think
work,
that they would do that before, this is the first outing, they name him on the front page of the New York Post. You think they might have done that before alleging this. But the point is that, Roosevelt, it was all operational, right? He was willing to defend a friend who was gay from a political attack because he was his friend and his ally. But when the similar tactics were being used against an adversary of his, he's quietly sending support to the Post to continue doing it. So we learn a lot, I think, about each president through their relationship to this issue of homosexuality.
It is striking that LBJ had no patience for this at all. I mean, he was ruthless, people right off.
Right, he was ruthless, and so
And only Lady Bird had some sympathy.
Lady Bird, and it's very important. Yeah, I mean, Lady Bird, who was always publicly supportive of her husband, this one time when Walter Jenkins, who was the right-hand man of LBJ, he was caught drunk having sex in the YMCA around the corner from the White House 3 weeks before the election in 1964. Lady Bird released a public statement expressing sympathy for Walter. And we also know because of the tapes that LBJ recorded all of his conversations. We have the tape of her really imploring her husband to do something for Walter because he's been really good to you. And if you don't, if we have to give him a job at the TV station we own, or you got to do something, you have to issue a public statement or try to protect him to the extent that you can, because it's going to send a really bad message to all the other people, all your other loyalists in your political operation. So she was a very smart woman and a very compassionate one too. I mean, it was not easy at that time to come out publicly for someone who at the time was the most famous homosexual in America, was Walter Jenkins, right? I mean, he's on the front page of every newspaper. I mean, and in fact, it came up unprompted in several interviews, or just conversations that I've had, often with straight people, about this book. Straight people who were, say, in their early teens when the Walter Jenkins scandal broke out. And they told me that was the first time I heard about homosexuality. My father had to explain to me, right? Because the way they would describe it in the news reports was, Walter Jenkins was arrested on a morals charge. That was the term that they would use. Well, Daddy, what's a morals charge? Okay, can you imagine having to explain to your 12-year-old son or daughter in 1964 why was this man arrested? So, and imagine what that does to a young gay person who's 12 years old in 1964, that this is the first exposure they have, that this is what I am. I'm caught in a stinking, disgusting YMCA basement, having sex with someone and arrested for it. And that's how it's written about, and that's the only understanding that people had
Right.
of homosexuality in that period of time.
Oh, that's true.
There was no Will and Grace, there was no Pete Buttigieg, there was no positive representations of gay people in public life. It was, you were arrested in the public bathroom.
And that's how actually straight people thought all gay people had sex.
Absolutely.
There were no such things
And a
as
lot of
relationships.
and a lot of gay people too.
Right. I mean, part of it was that they were afraid to come out, so they couldn't have relationships.
Absolutely.
But one of the things that struck me, and that story is certainly connected with this, is how you have all these people through this period of 40 years where, as you say, being gay was like the worst thing you could do, especially in the positions of authority and importance that they had, doing all kinds of crazy, reckless things. I mean, the idea that the guy would walk from his office in the Oval Office practically across the street to the Y and get arrested in a stall is really quite remarkable. And Sumner Wells is another, but there's a bunch of them.
Well, one of the things you notice in a lot of these stories is the presence of alcohol.
Uh-huh.
I mean, Sumner Wells would only do this when he was very drunk. And Walter Jenkins would only do this when he was very drunk. And
You recount every martini he had that
yeah,
night.
and it came up in the police reports. And I think that's actually an important thing to keep in mind, is that for a lot of these men, this was something that they could only do, right? They could only muster up the courage, or whatever word you want to use, the fortitude, the recklessness, under the strong influence of alcohol, which, by the way, was another way that they could justify and rationalize this to themselves. And that's how LBJ was able to rationalize it to himself. He could not comprehend how Walter Jenkins, who had worked by his side for 25 years, was a homosexual. Did that make sense to him? It was either the Soviets set it up, or the Goldwater campaign set it up, or he was so drunk he didn't know where he was. And for a lot of gay people too, that's how they could lie to themselves about this, right? This is only something I do when I'm drunk. I'm not a homosexual.
Yeah.
Which, by the way, is something that, I'm 38. I heard from, people my age and my generation would rationalize to themselves, right? They would maybe have sex with someone of the same sex with another man, and then the next morning that was just whatever. I was drunk, right? So alcohol plays a unfortunate role.
Well, sure.
In this book.
Yeah. So you have a bunch of other interesting people that come into this, and I'm going to ask you to talk about a few more. But why don't we pick up on the theme you asked about before, which is explaining why you thought the right place to start really. I mean, you have a few mentions of earlier history, but von Steuben and stuff like that. But basically, you start in the 30s or 40s, and then you end up in the late 80s.
Yeah. A few reasons. One is that the New Deal is really when Washington transforms from being a sleepy southern town into a real metropolis, right? Because the size of the population swells, the federal government is growing, and then you have a lot of gay people, coming from rural places to a city. And really, the story of gay people in America in the 20th century is, to a large degree, a story of urbanization. It's people leaving small towns where they're living under, the prying eyes of their parents or their neighbors, and coming to a place where they can be more anonymous. And that's why you have gay subcultures developing in American cities in the 1930s, and particularly after World War II. But the main reason I started with Roosevelt and World War II is because World War II is when homosexuality transforms from being merely a sin, a crime, and a medical condition to being also a national security threat. Because it is this terrible secret for all these reasons I just elucidated, right? It's illegal in all 50 states to be gay. It is a medical condition, and you could be sent to St. Elizabeth's Hospital, not far from here, and be subjected to all sorts of medicalized forms of torture, castration, lobotomies.
Shock treatment. Yeah.
Shock treatments, right? And it was a sin, and it was denounced not only from the pulpits of every major religion, but every social group in America, the media. I mean, gay people didn't have any friends or advocates in America in 1941 or 2. And so the belief is that because it is this terrible, deep, dark secret, that gay people therefore have to, will be more liable to blackmail, right? That they will be more liable to surrender secret, confidential information to an adversarial foreign power, because they'll do anything to protect this terrible secret from being revealed. And so that is when you see, and it's funny, I couldn't find any examples of like gay political or governmental scandals in this country.
You mean like actual espionage type stuff?
Well, I just mean I couldn't find any gay people being like kicked out of public office or government office until World War II, until Sumner Welles and David Walsh. And I think that's because national security, which is a concept that we're now all very familiar with, it didn't exist in this country until World War II. I mean, I came across an anecdote that I tell, and I think it's very illustrative of FDR's naval aide, a man named John McCrae. His diaries are in the Library of Congress, and he's telling a story sometime in the late 1930s, before World War II. He's walking past the Corcoran Gallery right near the White House, and he sees a white piece of paper just flying through the air. And he snatches it, and he looks at it, and it says State Department, top secret. The State Department used to be in what's now the Eisenhower building, with the Department of State, War, and the Navy. And so just, there was an open window, it was a windy day, and a confidential document flew out the window. And that is how, that's how secrets were handled in Washington before World War II. There was not this sense of, we need to keep things very secretive, and we need to compartmentalize this information. The CIA isn't. The first civilian intelligence agency is founded in 1942, the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services. It's the predecessor to the CIA. So World War II is really when America becomes a global power and really becomes obsessed with secrecy. And then all of a sudden, you have these secret citizens, gay men and women, become vectors of danger. They become vectors of treason, of espionage, right? And so they have to be kept out at all costs.
Right. And of course, that becomes the essence of the Lavender Scare and the McCarthy period, which is a story that's been told in other places to some extent.
Yeah.
But I think it's really interesting how you focused on this quite appropriately, I think how for all of the denunciation of people for being gay is almost worse than being a communist, and maybe the same thing in any event. The downfall of McCarthy really was about a gay relationship that he tolerated, and well, there's some question whether he was gay too, right?
Yeah, so the Army McCarthy hearings, which involved his aide, Roy Cohn, who you're probably familiar with, the chief counsel on the investigative subcommittee, and a young man who Roy Cohn was adamant that Joe McCarthy hire, named David Shine, who was a hotel heir, who didn't really have any qualifications to be on a committee investigating communism, other than what one journalist referred to suggestively as the looks of a Greek god, right? And so when Shine got recruited into the military, he was drafted. This is still when America had the draft in the 1950s. Cohn went to great lengths to get Shine, a commission as an officer, so he wouldn't have to, clean up the kitchen and go off every weekend and whatnot, and really started threatening the Army, threatening them with investigations and that he would investigate homosexuals on various Army bases and whatnot. And this all blows up in McCarthy's face, and we have the Army McCarthy hearings. And it's during the Army McCarthy hearings where you have the very famous exchange with the Army's lawyer, a man named Joseph Welch, from a very distinguished Boston Brahmin law firm, Hale and Dorr. And it's during those hearings when he says to Joe McCarthy, "Have you no decency, sir?" Right? And this has been replayed millions of times, and it's a great moment in American history. And that really was when you can trace the downfall of McCarthy. But McCarthy got himself into this mess, I argue, because of Roy Cohn's, homosexual lust for David Shine. That's really what.
No question.
That's really what brought him down. And if he had told Cohn, forget this, like Shine's been drafted, enough, like this is ridiculous, we're not going to indulge
He's
this.
just a kid, right? Yeah.
If he had said that, then who knows what would have happened? His reign of terror might have gone on much longer.
Yeah.
But for whatever reason, Roy Cohn was a very persuasive, captivating presence. He was only 26, by the way, when this was happening. He was an extremely brilliant, cunning, evil man, but he clearly had a hold on McCarthy of some kind. And it's alluded to, the senator from Vermont, forgetting his name, Frank, Republican senator from Vermont, gave a very kind of suggestive speech on the Senate floor, where he's talking about the senator, the chief counsel, and the consultant on the committee, and he's saying, well, what is the nature of this relationship? Why does the consultant have this hold on the chief counsel? He's really kind of
Everybody was
suggesting,
talking about
everyone's
it.
talking about it, but it was never explicit.
Right.
And that is what made this book both a challenge and also very frustrating to write, is that homosexuality was such a taboo topic that it was often not even spoken of. And one of the things I discovered in this book was all the euphemisms that people would come up with to talk about homosexuality, because the word homosexual was just not something you would say in polite company.
Didn't appear in the newspaper.
No, and during the David Walsh scandal, right, the senator who's outed from Massachusetts, the Senate Majority Leader is addressing this topic on the Senate floor, right, because one of their colleagues has been accused of this, and he refers to it as a crime too loathsome to mention in the presence of ladies and gentlemen in the United States Senate, right? A crime too loathsome to mention. You could talk about communism. You could say the word communism.
Sure.
We said it a lot. Okay? And then
Yes,
you
we
couldn't
did.
utter this word. It was so terrible. It was so awful. And you know, communists could become ex-communists. And in fact, some of the most important leaders of the early American conservative movement were ex-communists. The homosexual could never, you could never wash that away, right? And so that's one of the reasons why being a homosexual was worse than being a communist.
So there are large chunks of this book, Jamie, where it feels like you're writing a book about the State Department and not about Washington, D.C. And I wonder if you could tell us what you think that's about.
Well, the State Department in the 1930s, really before World War II, and actually before McCarthy, right? But the State Department was a relatively welcoming place if you were a gay man.
Because you would go off to be
You could be
foreign service.
You could be
and
in the foreign service, and you could travel overseas, and so
nobody
you could,
expected you to be married.
no one expected you to be married. You could be a bachelor without raising eyebrows, right? You could travel. Maybe you go to countries where they have a more lax attitude about these sorts of things, right? So if you were a gay man and you were of means, right? Because to serve in the State Department at that time, you had to be of a certain pedigree, right? You could maybe get away with being gay, and I write about a number of people in the who did. And so this is part of the reason why when McCarthy launches his lavender scare against the State Department, there is a sort of background to it, right? And it's more than that, though. It's kind of the gender perception, right? McCarthy was attacking the Truman administration for being weak on communism. And it's the State Department, right? It's a FET,
who were basically Ivy League,
cookie pushers.
WASPy,
So there's a whole
East
class element.
Coast.
There's a class element
Yeah.
to it too, right? So we want to fight the Reds, and it's the State Department that is negotiating. They're doing diplomacy. They're cookie pushers, and it's a class thing too, right? So you look at McCarthy, also the FBI versus the CIA and the State Department. What is the FBI? The FBI is what we used to refer to as white ethnics, right? It's a lot of Irish, Italian Americans, Central and Eastern European Americans from working class backgrounds. Catholics are in the FBI. What is the CIA and the State Department? It's a lot of Yale, Harvard, Princeton, boarding schools, notorious hotbeds of homosexuality, right? And in fact, there's a great line from Daniel Patrick Moynihan, one of my favorite senators, who said during the era of the security clearance, it was the Fordham men who did the checking and the Harvard men who were checked, right? And so there's a whole class element to this. And if you also think about it, the upper classes are associated with effeminacy because they're not working with their hands, right? Working class people work with their hands. They're tough, they're masculine, they build things. People who go to fancy schools and serve in the State Department or the CIA, they never have to work with their hands. And so what does that mean? It means that they're a FET. It means that they're homosexual. This is also where I think a lot of as Americans, our cultural conceptions of British people being gay comes from too, right? Because they have these fancy schmancy accents and they go to Eton and all. At least these are the British people that in the book in the 1940s and 50s. This is the cultural archetype of the Brit.
P.G. Wodehouse.
It's
kind of
P.G.
version.
Wodehouse.
Yeah.
It's people wearing Homburg hats and fancy tailored
Brideshead
suits.
Revisited, yeah.
Brideshead Revisited. You're not. I mean, there are obviously lots of working class British people, but you're not seeing them on television and film, and certainly not in Washington. The kind of the British people who are coming to Washington are of that certain class, and so there's a whole class and regional element in this kind of homophobia.
So, as you say, the whole idea of what was so dangerous was that people could be blackmailed and therefore would betray their country.
Yeah.
That was at least a
That
part
was
of
the
the
reasoning.
rationale. Yeah, to the extent it was reasoning. It was reasoning that Frank Kameny, as you note,
Yep.
undercut by saying, well, all right, we'll be out. Then
Yes.
you won't have any reason to fire us. It didn't
Absolutely.
work. But,
No, it didn't. And
not
also
for a
the
long time.
Defense Department in the early 1990s commissioned a study, belatedly,
Yeah.
where they studied 121 cases of Americans who were convicted of espionage in the history of the United States. 6 of whom were homosexual, not a single one of whom did it because of blackmail. They did it for money
Right.
or ideology. So there wasn't a single example of a gay person doing this because of the rationale that was cited to keep them out of government. The one case was a case involving the head of the Austro-Hungarian military counterintelligence in 1913, a man named Colonel Alfred Radel, who was a spy for the Russians. And when the Austro-Hungarian military found out, and he was gay, by the way, okay, and when
They
they
were
found
paying him a lot of money, too.
he was the reason he was doing it was because of money. He was very
Yeah.
greedy. He had multiple cars, houses, a wine cellar with thousands of bottles of wine. So this was not actually revealed until many years later, after the Russian archives opened, and it was discovered that the Russians didn't even know he was gay, right? But at the time, this became a myth. The Radel story became a myth. And in fact, Allen Dulles, who was the first civilian director of the CIA, he was a young diplomat in Vienna in 1916.
Wow.
And in his biography, the biographer says that 3 years after this Radel case, right, it's World War I, and Radel was blamed in large part for the military losses that the Austro-Hungarians were suffering against the Russians. They blamed him for it. And his biographer says that Dulles was living in this city that was still awash and living under this cloud of homosexuality and espionage and treason. Right? It was just in the air. So you can imagine what impact that had on Dulles. And decades later, Dulles was still talking about the Radel case. And in fact, it was just part of the dialogue among Western intelligence officials. In the 50s and 60s, the early years of the Cold War, the Radel case was sort of the paradigmatic case of the traitorous homosexual and why you can't have homosexuals in intelligence services. And it turns out the story wasn't even true.
So you do tell one story where the Soviets tried this. I mean, this
Well, yeah,
is
there's actually a case
this
where
is the Joe Alsop story.
Joe Alsop, who was one of the most influential newspaper columnists in America and a hardened Cold Warrior.
Had a lot of access to high levels.
Oh, yeah, he was friends with the Roosevelts, and
The
he was
Kennedys.
great friends with Jack Kennedy.
Yeah.
And in 1957, he is visiting Moscow. He interviews Khrushchev on this trip. And, one night, he has a little bit too much to drink, and the Soviets sit him at dinner with a very handsome young man. And one thing leads to another, and they go up to this young man's hotel room, and the next morning, boom, these KGB agents bust in with photographs of what happened the night before. And Alsop would later say he was contemplating suicide, he didn't know what to do. What he ended up doing was he went straight to his friend, who happened to be the ambassador to Russia, Charles Bolin, who was straight and himself a target of the Lavender Scare. When Eisenhower was nominating him, McCarthy went after him, accusing him of being gay.
Right.
Although Charles Bolin was not gay at all. But he could sympathize, and he was friends with Alsop, and Alsop wrote out a confession of everything that had happened. How he had too much to drink, how this young man started talking to him, one thing led to another. He wrote out an entire confession. They gave it to the CIA. So he did exactly what a gay person in that situation should have done and would have been expected to have done by the national security state, right? He didn't flip and become a Soviet agent. He went to his government and confessed everything. And J. Edgar, this confession got into the hands of J. Edgar Hoover, who tried to use it against Alsop, right? And so even Alsop's example, it didn't have any impact on government policy. You would think that maybe someone would say, hey, you know what, here's this guy, Joe Alsop,
The one time
who's
this
gay,
happened, it didn't happen.
and here it happens, and he did what he was supposed to do. Maybe we might learn something from this example. No.
Yeah. Let's fast forward to the 70s and 80s, where you tell a very different set of stories about how suddenly Washington is this town where a clever, aggressive, young, handsome gay man can become the center of the social scene for a
Yeah.
period of years.
Yeah.
This is Washington when it was more important to be invited to the right dinner party than to go anywhere else or do
Yeah.
anything else. Then restaurants were still pretty atrocious.
Yeah. Right.
Some of us will remember. So tell us about Steve Martindale.
Steve Martindale,
and then
yeah.
Craig Spence maybe as well
Yeah.
a little later.
So there are these figures. Steve Martindale was a young, like many gay men, I think, who come to this town, kind of overachieving, very smart, very sociable.
Lawyer, right?
He was a lawyer and a consultant. He worked and a PR guy. He worked for
Hill and Knowlton or
Hill and
something like
Knowlton,
that, yeah.
right? And he had worked for liberal Republicans on the Hill, and he in his late 20s, at 29, he had met John Lennon and Yoko Ono in New York. And for some reason, Yoko Ono's previous husband had run away with their child, and they needed to get custody of the child. And he says, you know what, I'm going to throw you a party in Washington, and I'm going to invite all the most influential people, and you can make your case to them. And that becomes kind of the start of these sorts of salons that he starts throwing, right? And he's not really openly gay. He's sort of, it's kind of, he's a bachelor. And Sally Quinn writes this devastating profile of him in 1975 where she never just comes out and says it, but she says things like, to be a successful socialite and party host in Washington, you have to be sexually non-threatening. Which, if you're a man, what does that mean? It means you're gay, right? In 1975 in Washington, right? You're not gonna.
But this generation of young gay men replaces all these old
Pearl Mesta,
Cadillacs kind of
Fritz.
women. There were
Right. So you have in the 70s, you have Bob Gray, Steve Martindale. There's a couple of others. The real estate developer Bob Alfondre.
Right.
And they kind of become the kind of reigning social doyens.
And people like
of
Henry Kissinger
Washington.
and everybody else are
Yeah.
going to the House.
Well, so what Martindale came up with this great, notorious party host trick, where if you want to get influential people to your dinner party, and what he did was he wanted to get Henry Kissinger and Alice Roosevelt Longworth to a birthday party that he was going to throw for a woman whom he barely knew. So what he did was he called up Henry Kissinger's office and he said, Alice Roosevelt Longworth is going to be there. So I think Secretary Kissinger might want to come. And then he called up Alice Roosevelt Longworth and said, Secretary Kissinger is going to be there. Okay, neither of them
And you said
had confirmed.
he wants you to be there too.
He wants you to be there as well,
Yeah.
right? He actually specifically mentioned that he wants you to come, right? And this is really risky, right? Because, if they don't show up, or if one of them shows up, then it's really insulting. It turns out they both show up at this party. And then he becomes, it becomes this incredible social coup. And he develops this reputation that Sally Quinn, tried to puncture, and she did that. I talked to people interviewing. I interviewed people for this book about Steve Martindale, and they brought up, that Sally Quinn profile, 40 years later. It was
Right.
that sort of that
She
memorable.
was the commentator on these things.
Yeah, she was developing a real reputation actually she said that she learned how to cover parties in Washington from a former cops reporter who told her, cover parties like they're crimes. and so that's how she would cover a party, like a crime had been committed. Craig Spence is a real, he was referred to as the mystery man. Craig Spence was a former journalist for CBS News. He had worked in Vietnam, and then he spent a couple years in Japan. And he comes to Washington right at the beginning of the Reagan era. And he's one of a number of powerful, conservative, secretive gay men in Reagan's Washington. Bob Gray is another.
Right.
Bob Gray, who had worked in the Eisenhower administration, who was the chairman of Reagan's inaugural committee, and then ran Gray and Company, also known as Gay and Company, which was one of the leading public affairs firms in Washington. And these were sort of semi-closeted gay men. Craig Spence was one. Craig Spence would host these, salon dinners. He worked for, no one could really know, these sort of mysterious, shady Japanese business interests. And he would host these dinners with, the toast of the town would come to these dinners. But then in 1989, that summer, he is accused of leading or organizing tours for male prostitutes at the White House. In the Washington, and again, the story isn't true, but the Washington Times seizes on this, and they publish front page story after front page story, and it goes on for months. I mean, they're trying to, by the admission of their own editor, they're trying to turn this into a Watergate.
Right.
You know, the Watergate's going to take down the George H.W. Bush administration. And it's interesting because, you know, all these rich and powerful, influential people, Phyllis Schlafly, I mean, lots of conservatives, they had all gone to Craig Spence's home.
And he was outed as having hired prostitutes.
He did hire prostitutes, right? But there were no prostitutes on this tour. It was clearly what it was is that there was a kind of internal war within the Republican Party at that time in the late 80s, early 90s, between the kind of social conservative right wing and the more moderates who were trying to move beyond the gay issue, right? And you would see that in 1992 with the horrible Republican National Convention in Houston where Pat Buchanan gave that, well, as Molly Ivins later said of Pat Buchanan's speech, it sounded better in the original German. There you go. Okay. And so this is a couple years before that, right? And so Craig Spence was sort of a victim of that, right? Because he was in these Republican circles, he was a gay man, he was dying of AIDS at the time, actually, and he ended up committing suicide at the Ritz-Carlton Hotel in Boston. And it was he was a character, okay?
Mm-hmm.
And he wrote some note in black marker, you know, like "Goodbye, Chief" on the mirror. He was found in a tuxedo, having taken pills, and he had a cassette tape player. It was playing Eine kleine Nacht music. I mean, it was all sort of a very dramatic farewell. Yeah. But he was just, you know, and Terry Dolan was another one of a very powerful, influential leader of a pack.
But he was actually part of the religious conservative wing of the group.
Well, he wasn't himself religious, but he was allied with the religious right. Yeah. And so there was just a number of these very powerful, high-ranking conservative gay men in Reagan's Washington. And I just found them to be fascinating characters because they're really walking a tightrope. You know, it was just a really kind of dramatic, high-pressure existence that they had to lead in that period of time.
Even in the 80s.
Because that's when outing really took off.
Right.
Right? Because up to that point, certainly among gay people, there was something called the code. And gay people would not out one another. All the outings that I talk about, you know, David Walsh and the other ones, those were straight people outing gay people. In the 80s, you start seeing gay people outing other gay people because that is when homosexuality is becoming more of a partisan issue.
Sure. Right,
because up until that point, everyone was an enemy of the gays, right? But in the mid to late 70s, early 80s, you have, you know, the left, the progressives, some elements of the Democratic Party are kind of embracing gay rights. And you have also openly gay people, which didn't really exist in Washington until the 70s, right? And they're starting to say, well, I'm out of the closet. You're not, and you should be. And more than that, you're working for people who are hurting us. Yeah. And so this is when the issue of hypocrisy, right? This is what's used to justify outing. Because prior to that, in fact, you know, Anita Bryant apparently had a gay person on her staff.
And no one outed him?
No one outed him.
That's amazing.
Which tells you how strong that code was. In fact, Barney Frank said, you know, in the early 80s, late 70s, early 80s, the gay bar was like neutral Switzerland.
Yeah.
Everyone outside of the gay bar would be fighting politically, right? Republicans versus Democrats, liberals versus conservatives, you know, lobbyists for labor unions against lobbyists for business. But they went into that gay bar and it was like an omerta. Everyone's on the same same team.
So I think we have a time for a couple of questions, if that's all right. Dave, you have the microphone there, so does anybody have a question they want to ask?
Thank you so much for creating what is certain to be a powerful work in our queer canon. You mentioned in the beginning that this culture of secrecy had an impact on the Black civil rights movement.
Yes.
And so I'd love to hear a story or two
Sure.
about that. Thank you.
Well, I tell the story of Bayard Rustin, who is one of my favorite figures from history, a great moral leader whose legacy should be more well known than it is. And he was the organizer of the 1963 March on Washington, and he was the brains behind that. And he was a gay man. and relatively openly gay. I mean, he wasn't, shouting it from the rooftops, but certainly Martin Luther King knew, and the leaders of the African American Civil Rights Movement knew that he was gay. And in fact, at one point, Adam Clayton Powell Jr. was upset with Martin Luther King for organizing protests outside the 1960 Democratic Convention, and he threatened to accuse Martin Luther King and Bayard Rustin of being lovers. And in fact, Rustin at that point was shunted aside from the Civil Rights Movement because they basically wanted to appease Adam Clayton Powell Jr. So a couple weeks before the March on Washington in 1963, Strom Thurmond, the segregationist senator from South Carolina, he had run on a third-party segregationist ticket, the Dixiecrat ticket in 1948. He gives a speech on the floor of the Senate because he's trying to basically ruin the March on Washington. And he has in his possession a police record from an arrest of Rustin about 10 years earlier in Pasadena, California, on a morals offense. How he got a hold of this, we still don't know. Probably the FBI, probably someone in Hoover's FBI gave it to him. It's hard to know how else, a police record from Pasadena would find its way to the Senate floor. And Strom Thurmond gives this speech where he declares to the world that Bayard Rustin is a sexual pervert. Now, this had never been publicly stated before, right? I said Rustin was relatively open only among people who knew him. He was not identified publicly as a gay person. So he's outed on the floor of the United States Senate just a couple weeks. This is the lead organizer of the March on Washington. And what's remarkable is that the leaders of the march, A. Philip Randolph, Martin Luther King, Roy Innis, all of the leaders, they decide that they're going to defend Rustin. And it would have been easy for them just to say, you know what, you're too much trouble. We got, this is a gay thing. That's not our department. We got voting rights. We have, we've got enough problems right now. They decide to keep him on, and they defend him. And Rustin basically becomes the first American public figure to survive an outing through this experience. He's on the cover of Life magazine a couple weeks later. The march is a huge success, obviously. And Rustin goes on to have a very, distinguished career as an activist on not just African American civil rights, but on a whole host of issues. And I don't think that that's something that's widely remembered or acknowledged, right? That here's this very important moment in African American civil rights history. It's also an important moment in gay civil rights history, right? I mean, to have a public figure survive an outing like that, I think is very meaningful.
Another one? Good luck.
The World of Hybrid program.
James, the only error I found in your extraordinary book is the photograph that appears opposite page 205. It suggests that the demonstration was in early 1965. It's the last of the demonstrations in October of 1965. There were about 45 of us. We marched in front of the White House, and then we crossed the 14th Street Bridge to picket the Pentagon.
Right. I'm reading the caption. It says 1965. There's no qualifier.
No, but it suggests there were 1, 2, 3, 4.
One of the first demonstrations for gay equal rights.
Yeah.
Was it not one of the first?
Yeah, it was.
Okay.
But the first one was April
all right,
17, 1965. Anyways,
look it up, yeah.
Is Gary Aldridge still living?
Gary Aldridge was the first openly gay congressional staff member, right? Is that who he was?
Yeah.
I couldn't find him. I imagine he's. I mean, I don't want to look. I imagine I would have come across him somehow in my research, right? So I wasn't able to make contact.
He was a close friend of mine, but I haven't seen him in a generation.
Yeah, I don't know.
The gentleman with the red sweatshirt in the back has had his hand up a couple of times. But time for one more?
Maybe two more.
Okay.
Richard Harrell. Great book, great read. Thank you.
Thank you.
I want to look a little bit further down in the GS. I love your book. I mean, you have all this great detail and names that, we're familiar with. I used to visit DC a lot in the 70s. I had a whole slew of friends who were living here, who had moved here, mostly professional folks, Smithsonian, National Gallery, Library of Congress, the universities. They were all out. Their social lives were not confined to bars.
Yeah.
We used to go out, I mean, went to Mr. Henry's, which is still standing. So I want to ask about
What years was this?
70s.
When? After 75 or before 75?
As early as 72,
Okay.
and then throughout the decade.
Okay, because 75 is when the Civil Service Commission lifts the ban on gay people
Yeah. but-
serving.
oh,
So
I see what
that,
you're
so
saying,
that
yeah.
kind of created a real, openness
But
that
they-
didn't exist in
Yeah, well, they all seemed to feel like this was a really nice place to live.
Yeah.
And, I mean, I realize I'm looking back quite a ways here, but it felt like a good place to be a
Yes.
gay person. I was wondering if you have a little bit to say
No,
about
no, I mean,
that.
the 70s really changes a lot. And so 1975 is the year when the Civil Service Commission lifts the ban on gay people being able to serve in federal government jobs that don't require security clearance. But even in the years leading up to that, I mean, I was interviewing people, and you can read newspaper reports that, hey, there's this kind of gay scene developing in Washington, D.C. in the early 1970s. And I think this is actually happening in a lot of cities across America because of what happened at Stonewall, and you have this sort of efflorescence of, gay urban life is finally kind of coming out into the open. We're so far removed from that point, from the early years of the Lavender Scare and the kind of, the paranoid hunt for communists and queers, right? That by the early 1970s, again, in certain places, right, like the Library of Congress or the Smithsonian, yeah, but not in the CIA or the State Department, all right, or any of the security or really, I would say, most other cabinet departments, you would not see openly gay people. And in fact, I remember, yeah. So I remember I interviewed a guy who worked for, I think, HHS in the 1980s, who told me that, when he would answer the phone in his office, if a gay friend was calling, he would use, feminine terms to, how is she doing, right? Or how are they doing? And that was the same, I heard that same anecdote from a gay man in the early 1960s. And in fact, one of the reasons, they would come up with female names for each other so that their colleagues wouldn't suspect anything. So, what was Kitty doing last night, right? He was actually talking about Bob, okay? What was Martha doing? Using feminine endearments or feminine nicknames among gay men is something that's been, going on probably for hundreds of years and still does today. But here you actually had it was a necessity,
Yeah.
right? If you were working in a government agency well into the 1980s, I interviewed men who told me that.
Jamie, one other thing I forgot to ask you. It's notable, with the exception of a little discussion of Eleanor Roosevelt, that gay women are pretty absent from
They
this
are
story.
largely absent.
And that's a reflection, I guess, of the way power structure in America was for this period.
Look, women did not have positions of real political influence in this town. It's crazy to say this until the 1990s. They just didn't. I mean, we didn't have... From Perkins, what was her first name? Frances Perkins was the first female cabinet secretary. And then every administration would have the token woman cabinet secretary, usually in health and human services, right? Like the caring place. And it's not until Bill Clinton that you see more than one woman. And by the way, there's a lot of women. And what's interesting is that when the 90s come along, every woman in political power, there's lesbian rumors about her.
Yeah.
Not because they're true, it's because a woman in a position of power and authority that is such a, those are male or masculine associated traits that if a woman possesses them, it must be because she's a lesbian, right? So you have all these gay rumors about Janet Reno and Donna Shalala, Hillary Clinton, and that's a real kind of cultural phenomenon in the 90s. So look, there aren't that many women in the book, and that's just because of, the nature of this town and how it operated. Also, women were not victims of the Lavender Scare to the same extent that men were. They didn't have security clearances, so they weren't, to the same extent that men did, so they weren't under the suspicion of the investigatory agencies. Also, I'm not an expert on lesbian mating rituals or sexual practices, but lesbians are not meeting each other in the 1950s in public parks and restrooms. That's not how they're socializing. If you were a gay man and you wanted to be sexually active or just to meet other gay men, forget the sex. If you want to meet another gay man, where would you go? You go to Lafayette Square at night, right? And that's putting you in direct conflict with law enforcement, right? And so you just have gay men are being arrested at huge rates. That, by the way, that starts in the late 19th century, are the first reports of
I've always wondered why they
cruising.
picked Lafayette Square across
Well, I
the
think
street.
actually, if you want an image, if you want an image of what my book is about, it's the fact that directly across the street from the house of the most powerful man in the world is the gathering place of these secret citizens, right? Directly under his nose. That's where they're all meeting. And that just tells you everything about, I think, what my
And
book is about.
meeting is a euphemism.
Sure, right. So I'm going to sign some books, is that right? Or?
Yeah, well, first,
Yeah.
thank you, Paul, and thank
Thank
you,
you.
Jamie, so
Thank
much.
you very much.
Thanks, this is great, thank you.
And yes, there's still books available for sale in the
Sell some
back with
books.
Little District, and Jamie will set you up to do some signing. Check out this table. There's info about upcoming programs, as well as the Rainbow History Project and DCPL's own archives that Jamie also used to research the book. So check that out. Thanks for coming, everybody.